The rain hammered against the windshield as I sat in the rental car outside the Riverside Country Club. Through the blur of water and moving wipers, I could see the warm glow spilling from the windows of the reception hall. Laughter drifted across the parking lot, muffled but unmistakable. Inside, my father was being honored for 30 years of service to Martinez and Associates, the law firm that had consumed more of his attention than his own daughter ever had. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I hadn't planned to come. The invitation had arrived at my apartment in Colorado Springs 3 weeks ago, forwarded through 2 previous addresses before finally reaching me. Standard cardstock, elegant font, my name spelled correctly for once. Major Sarah Daniels was invited to celebrate the distinguished career of Thomas Daniels, Esquire. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd included my rank on an invitation to a civilian event, especially since Thomas had spent the better part of my life pretending that rank didn't exist. My phone buzzed against the dashboard. A text from Captain Martinez, my second-in-command back at Fort Carson. Briefing moved to 0800 tomorrow. Safe travels, Major. I stared at the message, then at the building where my father was probably holding court, telling stories about his cases, his victories, his legacy. A legacy that had never included room for me. The last time I'd seen Thomas Daniels was 18 months ago, at my grandmother's funeral. He'd worn the same charcoal suit he probably had on tonight, stood with the same rigid posture that courtrooms had taught him. When people asked about me, he'd given them the same rehearsed answer he'd been using for years. Sarah's in the military. Keeps her busy. No mention of rank, no mention of deployments, no mention of the Bronze Star with Valor that sat in a drawer back in my quarters, still in its presentation box. That day, after the service, after the obligatory small talk with relatives who barely remembered my name, I'd approached him by his car. The conversation lasted exactly 93 seconds. I knew because I'd counted, the way I counted everything that mattered. Heartbeats during a firefight. Steps between cover positions. Seconds until backup arrived. Dad, I'd said, and he'd turned with that expression he'd perfected over the years. Not quite an annoyance. Not quite disappointment. Something emptier. Sarah, good turnout for your grandmother. She would have been proud. Yes, well. He'd adjusted his tie, glanced at his watch. I should get going. Client dinner. On a Sunday? The law doesn't observe weekends. I'd wanted to tell him about Afghanistan, about the patrol that had gone sideways outside Kandahar, about the choice I'd made that saved 6 lives and nearly ended my own. Instead, I stood there in my dress uniform, ribbons straight, shoes polished to mirror brightness, feeling like I was 7 years old again. Trying to show him a drawing from school. Maybe we could have dinner sometime, I'd said, when you're back in town. Thomas had paused, keys halfway to the ignition. For a moment, I thought he might say yes. Then he'd looked at me with those pale gray eyes that had intimidated juries for 3 decades. You know, Sarah, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time you considered what you want to do with your life. Really do. This military phase has gone on long enough. You're 31 years old. At some point, you need to stop playing soldier and figure out how to contribute something meaningful to society. The words had hit like shrapnel, sharp and scattered, and designed to wound in places you couldn't see. Playing soldier. As if the uniform I wore was a costume, the oath I'd taken a game, the soldiers under my command toys in some elaborate fantasy. I see. My voice came out steady, controlled. Years of training had taught me to compartmentalize, to function through pain. And what would you consider meaningful, Dad? Law school, medicine, something that builds rather than destroys, something that helps people instead of... He'd gestured vaguely at my uniform. Instead of whatever it is you do over there. I save lives. You carry a gun for a living, Sarah. Let's not dress it up as something noble. That was the moment something fundamental had shifted between us. Not broken, because you can't break something that was never whole. But clarified. The last thread of hope I'd been carrying for 24 years had simply dissolved. You're right, I'd said. Let's not dress anything up. I'd walked away then, got in my Jeep and driven back to the base. I hadn't spoken to him since. Now, sitting in this rental car outside his celebration, I wondered what had possessed me to come. Pride, maybe, or the kind of stubborn hope that survives logic. The invitation had arrived the same week I'd been selected for promotion to lieutenant colonel, the same week my commanding officer had recommended me for the Advanced Strategic Leadership program at the War College. Maybe some part of me had thought that if Thomas saw me now, really saw me, he might understand that I hadn't been playing anything. The rain began to ease, and I could see more clearly through the windows of the country club. Men in suits clustered around tables, women in cocktail dresses laughing at jokes I couldn't hear. It looked like every other legal gathering I'd been dragged to as a child, back when Thomas still believed I might follow in his footsteps, back before he'd given up on me entirely. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. My phone was ringing. Unknown number, but the area code was local. I almost let it go to voicemail, then curiosity won. Major Daniels. Sarah? Sarah, is that you? The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. Older, shakier than I remembered. This is Sarah. Who's calling? It's Eleanor. Eleanor Hoffman. From the neighborhood? I heard you were in town for your father's party. Mrs. Hoffman. The woman who'd lived 3 houses down from us when I was growing up, who'd always had homemade cookies, and actual interest in my science fair projects. I hadn't thought about her in years. Mrs. Hoffman, it's good to hear from you. Are you planning to go in to the party? I looked at the building again, at the warm light and the celebration I hadn't been invited to participate in, only to witness. I'm not sure. He doesn't know you're here, does he? The question caught me off guard. No, he doesn't. There was a pause, the kind that carries weight. Sarah, honey, there's something you should know. About tonight. About what's going to happen there. What do you mean? Just promise me you'll go inside. Promise me you'll stay until the end of the speeches. Can you do that? The urgency in her voice made something cold settle in my stomach. Mrs. Hoffman, what's going on? Sometimes, she said quietly, the universe has a way of setting things right. But you have to be there to see it happen. The line went dead. I sat there for another 10 minutes, watching the rain stop completely, watching the parking lot empty as more guests arrived. Finally, I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, straightened my uniform jacket, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Whatever was waiting for me inside, I was done running from it. The marble floors of the Riverside Country Club gleamed under crystal chandeliers that had probably witnessed 1,000 celebrations just like this one. I moved through the entrance hall with the measured pace I'd learned in officer training, neither hurried nor hesitant. The hostess at the reception desk wore a practiced smile and a name tag that read, Jennifer. Good evening. Welcome to the Daniels celebration. Thank you. I didn't offer my name. The fewer people who knew I was here, the better. The main reception hall buzzed with the particular energy of successful people congratulating each other on their success. Partners from Martinez and Associates, mixed with judges, city council members, and what looked like half the county bar association. Everyone held crystal glasses filled with wine that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. I found a position near the back wall, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid immediate detection. Thomas stood at the center of a circle near the bar, gesturing with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. He looked exactly as I remembered, silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to hide the slight softening that came with desk work and client dinners. Everything about him projected authority, respectability, success. The irony wasn't lost on me that we shared the same posture. Straight spine, shoulders back, chin slightly raised. The difference was that I'd earned mine in places where showing weakness could get you killed. His came from boardrooms, where the worst injury was wounded pride. Sarah? Sarah Daniels? I turned to find a woman about my age approaching with uncertain recognition in her eyes, blonde hair in a professional updo, designer dress that screamed corporate success. It took me a moment to place her. Monica Chen? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Oh my God, it is you! She moved closer, voice dropping to a confidential whisper. I wasn't sure. You look so different in uniform. Monica had been in my high school class, one of the kids who'd orbited around the popular crowd without quite belonging to it. Smart, ambitious, the type who had her college applications finished by October of senior year. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "I work at Martinez and Associates now, senior associate in corporate law." She glanced around nervously. "Your father doesn't know you're here, does he?" The question stung more than it should have. Even old classmates knew about the distance between Thomas and me. "What makes you say that?" Monica's expression grew uncomfortable. He never mentions you, ever. Some of us wondered if you were even still." She stopped herself. "Still alive?" "Still in contact." I watched Thomas across the room, noting how he commanded attention without demanding it, how people leaned in when he spoke. He'd always been good at that, at making others feel like they were part of something important just by listening to him. "We're not close," I said finally. Monica nodded like she'd expected as much. "He's proud of you, though. He has to be. Military officer, all those ribbons on your uniform. That's impressive." "He told you that?" "Well, no, not directly, but fathers are always proud of their children's accomplishments, right?" Before I could respond, the sound system crackled to life. A man I didn't recognize took the microphone at the front of the room, tapping it twice to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We're about to begin the evening's program." The crowd began gravitating toward the cluster of tables arranged around a small stage. I remained by the wall, content to observe from the periphery. Monica hesitated beside me. "Aren't you going to sit with your family?" I looked toward the front table where Thomas now sat with his second wife, Patricia, and her 2 children from her previous marriage. There was no empty chair, no place setting waiting for an unexpected daughter. The message was clear even if it wasn't intentional. "I'm fine here." The master of ceremonies turned out to be Robert Martinez, the senior partner whose name was on the building. He looked every bit the successful lawyer, with silver temples and the kind of tan that came from weekend golf games and vacation homes. 30 years ago, Martinez began, a young man walked into our offices with nothing but a law degree and an attitude that wouldn't quit. Tonight, we celebrate not just his anniversary with our firm, but the legacy he's built as one of the finest trial attorneys in the state. The crowd applauded politely. I found myself studying the faces around the room, wondering how many of these people actually knew Thomas beyond his professional reputation. How many had been invited to family barbecues, or knew his favorite movie, or understood that he collected vintage fountain pens because his own father had been a calligrapher. "Thomas Daniels has won cases that other lawyers wouldn't even take," Martinez continued. "He's built a reputation on the principle that every client deserves not just representation, but advocacy, that every case, no matter how small, matters." More applause. I thought about the cases I'd heard him discuss over dinner when I was younger, the late nights spent preparing arguments, the satisfaction in his voice when he called to share a victory. He'd been passionate about his work in a way that had impressed me even as a child. But tonight isn't just about professional accomplishments. It's about the man behind the attorney, a devoted husband to Patricia, a mentor to young lawyers, a pillar of our community. Patricia beamed from her seat at the head table. She was a nice woman, I had to admit. She'd married Thomas 5 years ago, bringing her own children into his life at a time when his biological daughter had already drifted too far away to matter. Sometimes I wondered if he was a better stepfather than he'd ever been a father. Thomas has always believed that success means more than winning. It means building something lasting, something that makes the world a little better than you found it. I shifted my weight against the wall, the familiar ache of old injuries reminding me of their presence. 3 surgeries on my left shoulder, metal pins in my right leg, and scars that would never fully fade. Evidence of a different kind of building, a different definition of making the world better. The speech continued with the standard tributes, the carefully crafted anecdotes designed to paint a picture of Thomas as both brilliant attorney and devoted family man. What struck me wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. No mention of military service in the family. No acknowledgement of sacrifice that extended beyond billable hours. No recognition that some people built better worlds not in courtrooms, but in places where justice was measured and lives saved, rather than cases won. As Martinez wrapped up his introduction, I noticed movement near the main entrance. A man in military dress uniform had arrived, his ribbons catching the light as he scanned the room. Even from a distance, I could see the eagles on his shoulders. Full colonel. He wasn't alone. 2 other officers flanked him, both in dress blues, both carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of career military. They moved through the crowd with purpose, looking for someone. Thomas had taken the microphone now, beginning his own remarks about gratitude and legacy and the importance of community. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was watching the 3 officers work their way closer to the front of the room, their presence creating subtle ripples of curiosity among the civilian guests. The colonel stopped near the bar, close enough to the head table to be noticed, but far enough away to remain unobtrusive. He caught Thomas's eye and nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry more weight than a simple greeting. My heart began to beat faster. Mrs. Hoffman's words echoed in my memory. Sometimes the universe has a way of setting things right. Whatever was about to happen, it was bigger than a simple law firm anniversary party. Thomas raised his champagne glass, his voice carrying across the room with the authority that had made him legendary in courtrooms across 3 states. The crowd had settled into that comfortable rhythm of a well-orchestrated celebration, everyone playing their assigned role in honoring a man who had never learned to honor his own daughter. When I started practicing law 30 years ago, Thomas began, I believed that success was measured in victories. Cases won, settlements negotiated, opponents defeated. But I've learned that true success is measured in the lives we touch, the community we build, and the legacy we leave behind. The crowd murmured appreciation. I found myself gripping my water glass tighter than necessary, watching him perform the role of humble patriarch, while 3 military officers stood silently near the bar, waiting for something I couldn't yet understand. My family has been the foundation of everything I've accomplished, Thomas continued, his arms sliding around Patricia's shoulders. Patricia, who brought joy back into my life when I thought it was too late for second chances. Michael and Jennifer, who welcomed me as a stepfather and taught me that love isn't about biology, it's about choice. Patricia beamed up at him. Her children, both in their 20s now, smiled from their seats at the head table. The picture of a successful blended family, complete and content. No gaps, no missing pieces, no daughters who'd chosen uniforms over law degrees. Monica shifted beside me, glancing between the happy family tableau and my stone expression. She was smart enough to recognize the omission, diplomatic enough not to mention it. Some of you might not know, Thomas's voice took on a more personal tone, that I have another child, Sarah, my daughter from my first marriage. My breath caught. After years of erasure, of being reduced to vague references and uncomfortable silences, he was actually going to acknowledge my existence. I straightened despite myself, some buried part of me still hoping for recognition, for understanding, for pride. Sarah chose a different path than the one I would have preferred for her. She joined the military after college, despite having been accepted to several excellent law schools. The way he said it made military service sound like a character flaw, a deliberate rejection of respectability. Several guests turned to scan the room, looking for this wayward daughter who disappointed her successful father. I won't pretend it's been easy, watching her throw away her potential. Sarah was brilliant, had every opportunity to make something meaningful of her life. Instead, she chose to play soldier, to waste her intelligence on a career that offers no real contribution to society. The words hit like physical blows. Play soldier. Waste her intelligence. No real contribution. Each phrase was a precise surgical strike designed to wound in places that wouldn't show. I've tried to understand her choice, tried to support it in my own way. But there comes a point when a parent has to accept that their child is determined to disappoint them. Sarah has been in the military for almost a decade now, moving from base to base, living a life that seems designed to avoid responsibility and commitment. Monica's intake of breath was audible. Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing honesty or cruelty. The 3 officers near the bar remained perfectly still, their faces unreadable. I mention this not to embarrass my daughter, but to illustrate a point about choices and consequences. In law, we understand that every decision creates precedent. Every action has ramifications. Sarah's choices have led her to a life of uncertainty, of following orders instead of giving them, of contributing nothing lasting to the world. My hands had gone numb. I set down my water glass before I dropped it, focusing on breathing steadily, while my father systematically dismantled my life in front of 200 people. She's been stationed overseas for years, doing what I can only assume is clerical work or security detail. Important sounding but ultimately meaningless assignments that keep her away from family, from building anything real. She rarely calls, rarely visits, and when she does, it's clear that she's still trapped in this adolescent fantasy of military glory. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand supportively, the gesture of a wife standing by her husband, as he dealt with the pain of a disappointing child. The crowd watched with the fascination people reserve for public confessions, uncomfortable but unable to look away. I've stopped expecting her to change, stopped hoping she'll realize that real honor comes from building communities, not tearing them down. The military teaches destruction, not creation. It takes young people with potential and turns them into followers, into cogs in a machine that serves no purpose but its own perpetuation. The colonel near the bar took a single step forward. His movement was subtle, controlled, but I caught it. So did Thomas, who glanced in his direction with mild irritation at the interruption. I mention all this because tonight is about legacy, about what we leave behind. Sarah will leave behind nothing. No family, no meaningful career, no contribution to speak of. She's chosen to be a burden rather than a blessing, a disappointment rather than a source of pride. A burden. The word hung in the air like smoke from a burned bridge. Everything I'd accomplished, every life I'd saved, every mission I'd completed, every soldier I'd trained, reduced to a single devastating label. Burden. But I've made peace with that disappointment. I've learned to focus on the family that chooses to be present, that shares my values, that contributes to something larger than themselves. Patricia, Michael, and Jennifer have shown me what it means to have a real family, one built on respect and shared purpose, rather than obligation and resentment. The applause that followed was muted, confused. People weren't sure whether they'd witnessed a touching tribute to his current family or a character assassination of his absent daughter. The distinction probably didn't matter to Thomas. In his mind, they were the same thing. I felt hollow, scooped out from the inside like something essential had been removed without my permission. This wasn't disappointment or frustration speaking. This was calculated cruelty, surgical precision applied to emotional destruction. This was my father using his greatest skill, his ability to construct compelling arguments, to publicly execute any remaining relationship we might have had. The three officers were moving now, weaving through tables toward the front of the room. The colonel's jaw was set in a way that suggested barely controlled emotion. His companions flanked him like an honor guard, their ribbons and medals catching the light as they approached the stage. Thomas saw them coming and paused mid-sentence, his practiced smile faltering slightly. This wasn't part of the program. This wasn't scripted or controlled or manageable. Ladies and gentlemen, the colonel's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. I believe there's been a misunderstanding here tonight. The room went silent. Even the servers stopped moving. 200 people held their breath, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Something that would change the evening's careful choreography into something no one had anticipated. Thomas gripped the microphone tighter, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. I'm sorry, but this is a private function. If you have business with someone here, perhaps we could discuss it after the program. The colonel smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who'd just been handed the perfect opportunity to correct a grave injustice. Oh, I think this concerns everyone here tonight, Mr. Daniels. Especially when you're talking about Major Sarah Daniels. You see, I know Major Daniels quite well. My world tilted sideways. The colonel knew me. More than that, he was here because of me. Mrs. Hoffman's mysterious phone call suddenly made sense. Somehow, she'd arranged this. Somehow, the universe was indeed setting things right. Thomas blinked, his confidence wavering for the first time all evening. I'm not sure what this has to do with anything. Everything, the colonel replied, stepping closer to the stage. You see, Major Daniels saved my life. The silence in the ballroom stretched like a taut wire. Colonel Harrison stood at the base of the stage, his dress blues immaculate, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from leading soldiers through hell and bringing them home alive. Behind him, the two other officers maintained perfect formation, their presence adding weight to whatever revelation was about to unfold. Thomas gripped the microphone with white knuckles, his lawyer's mind racing to regain control of a situation that had suddenly spiraled beyond his management. "I'm sorry, Colonel, but I think there's been some confusion. My daughter does clerical work overseas, security detail at best." Colonel Harrison's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Daniels, your daughter commands the 2nd Battalion, 75th Infantry Regiment. She holds the Bronze Star with Valor, the Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantry Badge. She's been recommended for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and selection for the Army War College's Advanced Strategic Leadership Program." The words fell like artillery shells into the pristine atmosphere of the country club. Gasps echoed from various tables. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Thomas stared at the colonel as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible. Sarah never mentioned any of that." "When did you last have a real conversation with your daughter, Mr. Daniels?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it again. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room, including himself. I pressed myself further back against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was happening. After years of silence, of swallowing every slight and insult, someone was speaking the truth about my service. But it felt surreal, like watching someone else's life being discussed. 3 years ago, Colonel Harrison continued, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, I was leading a convoy through the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan. Intelligence had indicated the route was clear, but intelligence was wrong. We drove straight into a complex ambush. Quote, he moved closer to the stage, his voice taking on the cadence of a man accustomed to briefing rooms and situation reports. 15 vehicles, 68 soldiers, caught in a kill zone with nowhere to run. The enemy had high ground on both sides, interlocking fields of fire, and enough ammunition to pin us down until reinforcements could finish the job. The room was completely still now. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen in place by the gravity of Harrison's words. My vehicle took an RPG hit 30 seconds into the fight. Driver was killed instantly, gunner was unconscious and bleeding out. I had shrapnel in my leg and a concussion that made it hard to think straight. The radio was dead, and I could hear my soldiers calling for help through the chaos. Patricia had gone pale. Several guests were staring openly at me now, beginning to piece together the connection between the colonel's story and the uniformed woman standing against the back wall. That's when Major Daniels arrived. Harrison turned slightly, his gaze finding me across the crowded room. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something I'd rarely encountered in my father's presence: respect. She wasn't supposed to be in that sector. Her unit was rotating back to base after a week-long operation in the mountains. But she heard our distress calls on the radio and made a decision that saved 68 lives. I remembered that day with crystalline clarity. The exhaustion of 7 days of patrols, the relief of finally heading home, and then Rodriguez's voice crackling through the static. This is Bravo 7. We are taking heavy fire and need immediate assistance. Major Daniels turned her convoy around and led them straight into the fight, Harrison continued. Not to establish a perimeter and wait for backup, not to call for air support and observe from a safe distance. She led a direct assault on the enemy positions. The memory came flooding back, the weight of the decision, the faces of my soldiers, the understanding that hesitation meant death for Harrison's people. I'd had maybe 10 seconds to weigh the options before giving the order to engage. She split her force into 3 elements, 1 to suppress the eastern ridge, 1 to flank from the south, and she personally led the assault on the western position. Under fire, uphill, against entrenched enemies who had every advantage except one. What was that? Someone called out from the audience. Harrison smiled grimly. They weren't fighting Major Daniels. Nervous laughter rippled through the room, but it carried an undertone of awe. These were civilians, who lived in a world where the most dangerous thing they faced was traffic during rush hour. The idea of deliberately running toward gunfire was as foreign to them as speaking Mandarin. The firefight lasted 47 minutes. When it was over, all 68 members of my convoy were alive. Major Daniels had taken 3 bullet wounds, had shrapnel in her shoulder, and was still directing medical evacuation when the cavalry finally arrived. I touched my left shoulder reflexively, feeling the familiar ache of metal pins and scar tissue. The wound had taken 6 months to heal properly, and it still bothered me when the weather changed. She spent 8 days in the hospital and was back on duty within 2 weeks, despite doctors recommending a month of recovery time. When I tried to thank her, she told me that's what soldiers do for each other. Thomas was staring at Harrison as if he'd never seen a human being before. The confident attorney who'd been controlling the room 5 minutes earlier looked lost, unmoored from everything he thought he knew about his own daughter. "But that's not why I'm here tonight," Harrison said, his voice hardening. "I'm here because of what happened 6 months later." The colonel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. Even from across the room, I could see the official letterhead, the signatures, the seal that marked it as authentic government correspondence. In January 2019, someone filed a complaint with the Inspector General's office alleging that Major Daniels had falsified her after-action reports, that she had exaggerated her unit's role in the rescue operation for personal glory. My blood turned to ice. I knew exactly what document he was holding, because I'd lived with its consequences for 3 years. The allegation claimed that Major Daniels was unstable, glory-seeking, and potentially dangerous to the soldiers under her command. It requested a full investigation into her fitness for duty and recommended immediate relief from command pending review. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Thomas had gone completely white, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone stand. The investigation took 11 months. During that time, Major Daniels was effectively sidelined. No promotions, no significant assignments, no opportunity to prove the allegations false. Her career was put on indefinite hold, while investigators tried to substantiate claims that were not only false, but deliberately malicious. Harrison unfolded the document, holding it up for the room to see. The complaint was eventually dismissed as completely without merit, but the damage was done. 11 months of Major Daniels' career were stolen by someone who wanted to destroy her reputation. He looked directly at Thomas now, his voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "The really interesting thing about military investigations, Mr. Daniels, is how thorough they are. We traced the complaint back to its source. A civilian who had access to just enough information about Major Daniels' service to make the allegations seem credible." Thomas swayed slightly, gripping the podium for support. Around the room, people were beginning to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a story about military heroism. This was about betrayal at the most fundamental level. Someone who knew her well enough to know which buttons to push, which doubts to plant, which fears to exploit. Someone who had access to her personal information and used it as a weapon against her career. Harrison folded the document carefully and returned it to his jacket. Someone who called the Inspector General's office and identified himself as a concerned father, worried about his daughter's mental state. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Thomas staggered, his face draining of all color. Patricia gasped audibly. Around the room, 200 people stared at a man they'd come to honor, trying to process the enormity of what they'd just learned. In the silence that followed, only one sound was audible, the quiet clicking of my heels against marble as I finally stepped away from the wall and began walking toward the front of the room. Every step across that marble floor felt like walking through quicksand. 200 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I made my way through tables of stunned lawyers, judges, and community leaders who had just witnessed their honored guest exposed as the architect of his own daughter's professional destruction. The click of my dress shoes against the polished stone seemed to echo in the cathedral-like silence that had descended over the Riverside Country Club. Thomas stood frozen at the podium, still gripping the microphone with white knuckles, his face a mask of dawning horror as he watched me approach. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the controlled concern of a lawyer facing a difficult cross-examination, but the raw terror of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. Colonel Harrison stepped aside as I reached the front of the room, giving me a subtle nod of respect. The two officers flanking him came to attention, their synchronized movement creating an honor guard formation that framed the stage. Behind me, I could hear whispered conversations beginning to bubble up from the audience, fragments of shocked commentary that I chose to ignore. "Hello, Dad." My voice carried clearly through the sound system, amplified by the microphone that Thomas still held in his trembling hands. The simple greeting landed like a grenade in the hushed atmosphere of the ballroom. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Sarah, there's been some kind of misunderstanding." I stopped directly in front of the stage, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead, close enough to count the lines that stress and guilt had carved around his eyes. "What kind of misunderstanding would that be?" The complaint. I was trying to protect you." A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. "Protect me? By filing false allegations with the Inspector General? By claiming I was mentally unstable and unfit for command?" The crowd stirred behind me. Patricia had her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with something between shock and revulsion. Michael and Jennifer, Thomas's stepchildren, sat rigid in their chairs, staring at the man they'd called father for 5 years as if seeing him for the first time. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," Thomas said, his lawyer's instincts kicking in even as his world crumbled. "Your mother was worried sick. You were in a war zone, getting shot at, and you wouldn't listen to reason. I thought if there was an investigation, if someone questioned your assignments." "You thought what?" I stepped closer to the stage, my voice cutting through his stammered excuses. "That you could manipulate the military justice system like you manipulate juries? That you could pull strings and have me reassigned to a desk job in Kansas? I wanted you safe. You wanted me gone." Quote. The words hung between us like a blade. Thomas flinched as if I'd struck him, but I wasn't finished. 11 months of enforced silence. 3 years of knowing the truth but having no way to prove it. A lifetime of being diminished and dismissed. All of it was finally finding its voice. "Do you have any idea what you cost me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. 11 months of my career. 11 months where every soldier under my command wondered if their commanding officer was really a fraud. 11 months where I couldn't get promoted, couldn't transfer, couldn't do anything but sit in a holding pattern while investigators tried to verify claims that you knew were lies. Thomas was shaking now, the microphone trembling in his grip. "Sarah, please. Not here. Not like this. We can discuss this privately." "Privately?" I looked around the room, taking in the faces of his colleagues, his friends, his wife, and stepchildren. "The way we've discussed everything for the past 10 years? In whispers and half-truths and convenient omissions?" I turned back to the audience, my voice rising to address the entire room. For those of you who didn't hear Colonel Harrison clearly, let me spell it out. My father filed a complaint with the military, claiming that I was mentally unstable, that I falsified official reports, and that I posed a danger to the soldiers under my command. He did this because he was embarrassed by my choice to serve my country instead of following him into law. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw Monica Chen near the back, her face pale with shock. Several of Thomas's law partners were exchanging worried glances, probably already calculating the potential damage to the firm's reputation. "The investigation nearly destroyed my career," I continued. "For 11 months I was treated as a suspect in my own command. Soldiers who had followed me into combat started questioning whether their trust had been misplaced. Other officers avoided associating with me because nobody wanted to be connected to someone under investigation for conduct unbecoming." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a document I'd carried for 3 years, waiting for this moment. "I have the Inspector General's final report right here. Would you like me to read the relevant sections aloud? The parts where they conclude that the allegations were not only false, but appear to have been filed by someone with a personal vendetta against the subject." Thomas stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the podium cables. "That's enough, Sarah. You've made your point." "Have I?" I stepped up onto the stage. moving within arm's reach of the man who had spent my entire life making me feel like I wasn't enough. Because it seems like you still don't understand what you did. The ballroom was completely silent now, the kind of absolute quiet that comes when everyone is holding their breath, afraid that any sound might shatter the moment and rob them of witnessing something extraordinary. You didn't just file false allegations against your daughter, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. You tried to destroy a decorated combat officer. You tried to end the career of someone who had saved 68 lives, who had been wounded in service to her country, who had earned the respect of every soldier she'd ever commanded. I gestured toward Colonel Harrison. You tried to destroy the career of the woman who saved this man's life, who carried 3 bullet wounds and still organized the medical evacuation of his injured soldiers, who spent her own recovery time writing letters to the families of his troops to assure them their sons and daughters were alive because of a split-second decision to turn around and fight. Thomas was crying now, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his actions finally registered. But I wasn't done. I had years of words backed up behind my teeth, and they were finally finding their way out. But here's what you never understood, Dad. Here's what you could never grasp in your world of billable hours and client dinners and comfortable compromises. I moved closer until we were eye to eye, close enough that only he could hear my next words. I am not your daughter anymore. I am Major Sarah Daniels, United States Army. I am the commanding officer of 600 soldiers who would follow me into hell because they know I would lead them out again. I am someone who matters, who contributes, who builds instead of destroying. I stepped back and raised my voice so the entire room could hear. I am someone who saves lives instead of ruining them. The sound of applause broke the silence like thunder. It started with Colonel Harrison and his 2 companions, sharp and precise, the kind of applause that speaks to respect rather than entertainment. Then it spread through the room, growing louder and more sustained as people rose from their seats one by one. Monica Chen was on her feet, clapping with tears in her eyes. Several of Thomas's law partners stood, their faces reflecting a mixture of respect and embarrassment. Patricia sat frozen in her chair, staring at Thomas as if seeing him clearly for the first time in their marriage. The applause continued for nearly a minute, washing over me like a warm tide. When it finally died down, I turned back to Thomas one last time. You called me a burden tonight, I said quietly. You told 200 people that I was a disappointment, that I had wasted my potential, that I contributed nothing to the world. I paused, letting the words settle. I want you to remember this moment, Dad. I want you to remember what it feels like to realize that everything you believed about your daughter was wrong. I looked out at the crowd one more time, then back at Thomas. I also want you to remember that despite everything you did to sabotage my career, despite the lies and the false allegations and the 11 months of hell you put me through, I never stopped serving. I never stopped saving lives. I never stopped being exactly who I was meant to be. The microphone was still in Thomas's hands, but he made no attempt to speak. What could he possibly say? What words could bridge the chasm that had just opened between us? I turned and walked toward the exit, my head high, my shoulders straight, every inch the officer I had become despite his best efforts to destroy me. Behind me, I heard Colonel Harrison's voice address the stunned audience. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Major Sarah Daniels. She is not a burden. She is not a disappointment. She is one of the finest officers I have ever had the privilege to serve with, and this country is safer because of her dedication to duty. As I reached the ballroom's main entrance, I heard one more voice call out across the room. It was Mrs. Hoffman, sitting at a table near the back that I hadn't noticed before. Sarah, she called, her voice carrying clearly through the silence. Your father may not be proud of you, but the rest of us are. I turned back one final time, caught Thomas's eye across the distance of marble floor and broken dreams, and smiled. Not with bitterness or anger, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally told the truth and found it liberating. Then I walked out into the cool evening air, leaving behind the wreckage of my father's reputation and the last remnants of my need for his approval. For the first time in my life, I was free. The parking lot felt like stepping into another universe. Cool night air wrapped around me. carrying the scent of spring rain and new possibilities. Behind me, the Riverside Country Club hummed with the aftermath of what had just transpired. Through the tall windows, I could see clusters of people in animated conversation, their gestures sharp with the energy that follows a shocking revelation. I leaned against my rental car, pulling out my phone to find 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word travels fast in the digital age, especially when that word involves a decorated war hero publicly dismantling her father's carefully constructed lies. The first message was from Captain Martinez back at Fort Carson. "Ma'am, not sure what just happened, but someone posted a video on social media. You okay?" Video. Of course someone had been recording. In an age where every public moment becomes potential content, my confrontation with Thomas was probably already spreading across platforms I'd never heard of. The sound of heels on asphalt made me look up. Patricia approached slowly, her earlier composure replaced by something raw, more uncertain. She'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill, but I suspected she was shivering from more than cold. "Sarah?" Her voice was tentative, nothing like the confident attorney's wife who'd presided over dinner conversations for the past 5 years. "Could we talk?" I studied her face in the parking lot lights. Patricia had always been kind to me in the distant way step-parents manage when they're trying not to overstep boundaries with adult children they barely know. But there was something different in her expression now, a recognition that those boundaries had just been redrawn in ways nobody could have anticipated. "What would you like to talk about?" She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I need to know how much of what you said there is true." "All of it." "The investigation? The false allegations?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Thomas really did that to you?" Quote. I nodded, watching her process information that was reshaping everything she thought she knew about her husband. He called the Inspector General's office in January 2019, claimed I was mentally unstable, and posed a danger to my soldiers. The investigation lasted 11 months. Patricia closed her eyes, and I saw her lips move silently as she calculated something. When she opened them again, her face was pale. He was traveling a lot that spring. Client meetings, he said. But he was agitated, making phone calls at odd hours. I thought it was work stress. She looked at me with something approaching horror. He was destroying your career, and I was making him dinner and asking how his day went. You didn't know. I should have known. She hugged herself tighter. The way he talked about you, or didn't talk about you. The way he changed the subject whenever someone asked about his daughter. I thought you two had just drifted apart, the way families sometimes do. Through the club's windows, I could see Thomas still standing on the stage, surrounded by Colonel Harrison, and what looked like a very serious conversation. His law partners had formed a protective circle around him, but their body language suggested damage control rather than support. "Patricia, you seem like a good person," I said finally, "but you married a man who was willing to destroy his own daughter's career because her choices embarrassed him. That's not something that happens in a vacuum." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "What am I supposed to do with that information?" "Whatever you need to do to live with yourself." The club's main doors opened, and people began streaming out. The party was over, though I suspected the conversations it had sparked would continue long into the night. I watched familiar faces from my childhood, neighbors and family friends who had just learned that the quiet Daniels girl had become someone far more complex than they'd ever imagined. Mrs. Hoffman emerged with the assistance of a younger woman I didn't recognize. Even at 78, she moved with the determined pace of someone who had something important to accomplish. She spotted me immediately and headed in my direction, her companion trailing behind. "Sarah Elizabeth Daniels," she said as she approached, using my full name the way she had when I was 12, and had been caught climbing her apple tree. That was quite a performance there. "It wasn't a performance, Mrs. Hoffman." Quote. "No," she agreed, reaching out to squeeze my hand with fingers that were surprisingly strong. "It was justice. Long overdue, but justice nonetheless." The younger woman stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being noticed. "Major Daniels? I'm Jennifer Walsh, investigative reporter with the Washington Herald. I was hoping we could talk." I tensed automatically. Military training had taught me to be wary of reporters, especially ones who showed up at family events with notebooks and pointed questions. This isn't the time or place for an interview. Actually, it might be exactly the right time, Jennifer said. What happened in there tonight? It's bigger than a family dispute. A civilian filing false allegations against a decorated officer? Using the military justice system as a weapon in a personal vendetta? That's a story that needs to be told. Mrs. Hoffman nodded approvingly. She's right, dear. Your father spent years controlling the narrative about your life. Maybe it's time you controlled it yourself. More people were emerging from the club now, and I could see several phones pointed in our direction. Whatever privacy this conversation might have had was rapidly evaporating. I need to think about it, I said to Jennifer, who handed me a business card with the practiced ease of someone who collected stories for a living. Fair enough. But Major, there are probably other families dealing with similar situations. Other service members whose careers have been sabotaged by people who should have supported them. Your story could help them. She was right, and I knew it. The military was a closed system in many ways, and civilian interference in military careers was more common than most people realized. Spouses filing complaints about deployments, parents trying to manipulate assignments, family members using insider knowledge to damage reputations. Colonel Harrison appeared at my elbow with the silent approach that senior officers perfect over decades of surprise inspections and unannounced briefings. Major, if I could have a word. I excused myself from the group and followed him a few steps away from the growing crowd of curious onlookers and determined reporters. That was well done there, he said quietly. Controlled, professional, effective. Your father won't recover from this easily. I wasn't trying to destroy him, sir. I was trying to tell the truth. Sometimes they're the same thing. He paused, studying my face in the parking lot lights. I wanted you to know that the Inspector General's office has reopened their investigation into false allegations. Your case isn't the only one they're looking at. The implications of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Are there others? 17 cases in the past 5 years where civilian complaints appear to have been filed with malicious intent rather than legitimate concern. Your father's case is the most egregious, but it's not unique. I thought about Jennifer Walsh's words, about other families and other service members who might be suffering in silence the way I had. The personal had suddenly become political, and my private confrontation had implications I was only beginning to understand. What happens now? Colonel Harrison smiled grimly. Now we make sure this never happens again. The Secretary of Defense is very interested in establishing new protocols for handling civilian complaints against military personnel, especially when those complaints come from family members. He handed me a folder I hadn't noticed him carrying. Your promotion to Lieutenant Colonel has been fast-tracked. Congratulations. You'll be taking command of the 3rd Battalion next month. The folder felt heavier than it should have, weighted with years of delayed recognition and long overdue vindication. Inside that manila envelope was everything Thomas had tried to prevent. Advancement, respect, acknowledgement of my actual worth, rather than his perception of my limitations. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Major. You earned this years ago. We're just finally catching up to what you've always been. As Colonel Harrison walked away, I looked back at the country club one final time. Through the windows, I could see Thomas still surrounded by lawyers and damage control specialists, his carefully planned evening transformed into a crisis management exercise. For 31 years, I had defined myself in relation to his approval or disapproval. Tonight, I had finally stepped outside that framework entirely. Whatever happened next, it would be on my terms, according to my values, in service to something larger than family dynamics and old wounds. I got in my car and drove toward the future I had always deserved, but had finally learned to claim for myself. 6 months later, I stood in the Pentagon briefing room where decisions that shaped the world were made daily. The walls were lined with portraits of military leaders who had guided America through its darkest hours, and today I was about to add my own chapter to that legacy. Not through combat heroics or tactical brilliance, but through something more fundamental, ensuring that no other service member would face what I had endured. The Daniels Protocol, as it had come to be known, sat in a leather portfolio on the conference table before me. 43 pages of policy changes, legal safeguards, and investigative procedures designed to protect military personnel from malicious civilian complaints. The name wasn't my choice, but I'd stopped fighting it when I realized that associating it with my story would give it weight in the corridors of power. Lieutenant Colonel Daniels, the Secretary of Defense, said as he entered the room, flanked by a constellation of generals and policy advisors. "Are you ready to make history?" The question would have terrified me 6 months ago, when I still defined my worth through other people's approval. Now it felt like coming home to a truth I'd always known but had never been allowed to speak. "Yes, sir, ready to serve." The briefing went exactly as we'd rehearsed. I presented the data. 17 documented cases of civilians using false allegations to damage military careers, the average 11-month investigation period that effectively destroyed promotion opportunities, and the psychological toll on service members who found themselves defending against accusations from their own families. But the real power wasn't in the statistics, it was in the stories. Captain Rodriguez, whose ex-wife had filed complaints claiming he was unstable after their divorce, derailing his promotion to major for 2 years. Staff Sergeant Williams, whose father had contacted her commanding officer with, quote, concerns about her mental health after she chose to deploy rather than attend his retirement party. Major Thompson, whose civilian brother had convinced investigators that his PTSD made him dangerous to his soldiers. 17 stories of family members weaponizing the military justice system against people they claimed to love. 17 careers damaged or destroyed by people who had never worn a uniform but felt entitled to manipulate those who did. The secretary listened without interruption as I outlined the new protocols: mandatory civilian counseling before any family member could file complaints, independent verification of allegations, and most importantly, criminal penalties for filing knowingly false reports against military personnel. This isn't just about protecting service members, I concluded. It's about protecting the integrity of our justice system from people who would abuse it for personal vendettas. The unanimous approval was swift and decisive. The Daniels Protocol would be implemented within 60 days, and I would oversee its rollout across all branches of the military. It was the kind of assignment that shaped entire careers, the kind of responsibility that came once in a generation. As the meeting adjourned, General Morrison approached me with the same expression I'd learned to recognize in Colonel Harrison's face: respect earned through fire rather than granted through politics. "Your father called my office yesterday," he said quietly. "He wanted to discuss your promotion, suggested that perhaps family dynamics were influencing your assignments." The old Sarah would have felt her stomach drop, would have wondered what new damage Thomas was trying to inflict. The new Sarah simply raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell him, sir?" I told him that Lieutenant Colonel Daniels was one of the finest officers in the United States Army, and that his opinion on military personnel matters wasn't required or welcome. Morrison smiled grimly. I also suggested he might want to focus on his own legal troubles. Thomas's troubles had indeed multiplied since that night at the country club. The Washington Herald had run Jennifer Walsh's investigation as a 3-part series that exposed not just his false allegations against me, but a pattern of using his legal connections to manipulate official processes when they didn't serve his interests. The Virginia State Bar was conducting its own investigation, and Martinez and associates had quietly asked him to take an extended leave of absence. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only the quiet relief of someone who no longer had to carry the weight of his disapproval. He had spent my entire life trying to reshape me into his image of what a daughter should be. Now he was discovering the consequences of trying to destroy someone who refused to be reshaped. The drive to Arlington National Cemetery took 40 minutes through D.C. traffic that moved with the patient determination of a city that understood the weight of its responsibilities. I made this trip once a month now, not out of obligation but out of gratitude for the man who had given me the foundation to become who I was meant to be. My grandfather's headstone was simple granite marked with the dates of his service in Korea and Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Michael Daniels, who had taught me to throw a baseball, to change a tire, and to stand up for what was right even when it cost you everything. "Hi, Grandpa," I said, settling cross-legged on the grass beside his grave. "I brought good news this time." I told him about the Pentagon meeting, about the protocol that would bear our family name for reasons that honored service rather than shame it. I told him about the soldiers who had already reached out, service members dealing with family sabotage, who now had hope for justice and protection. Thomas tried to destroy me, just like you always said he would, I said to the granite and the memory and the spring wind that carried cherry blossoms across the hallowed ground. But he forgot something you taught me. We don't serve our families. We serve something bigger than family. A shadow fell across the grass, and I looked up to see Patricia standing a respectful distance away. She looked older than she had 6 months ago, worn thin by the dissolution of her marriage and the discovery of what kind of man she'd shared her life with. I hope I'm not intruding, she said. I saw your car and thought, she trailed off, uncertain. It's fine, he would have liked you. She moved closer, reading the headstone with the careful attention people reserve for understanding someone through their final marker. Thomas never talked about his father. I always wondered why. Grandpa saw through him early. Said Thomas would rather be respected than right, and that was a dangerous combination in any profession. I stood, brushing grass from my uniform. Are you okay? I heard about the divorce proceedings. Patricia's smile was sad but genuine. I'm learning to be okay. It's strange, building a life around someone and then discovering they're not who you thought they were. She paused. Thank you, by the way. For what? For telling the truth. For showing me who I was really married to, before I wasted any more years on it. Quote, we stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two women who had been shaped by Thomas Daniel's capacity for manipulation, but had chosen different responses to that revelation. Patricia was rebuilding. I was building something entirely new. My phone buzzed with a text from Captain Martinez. New recruits asking specifically to serve under your command, ma'am. Word is spreading about the commander who fights for her soldiers. I smiled, thinking about the young faces that would soon be under my leadership, the men and women who would learn from me the way I had learned from Colonel Harrison and Staff Sergeant Daniels, and every leader who had shown me that service meant something larger than personal ambition. I should go, I told Patricia. New battalion to command, protocols to implement, soldiers to train. Will you ever forgive him? She asked as I turned to leave. I considered the question, looking back at my grandfather's grave and forward to a future that stretched bright with possibility. I don't need to forgive him, I said finally. I just needed to outgrow him. The drive back to base took me through neighborhoods where families were gathering for Sunday dinners, where children played in yards supervised by parents who would never think to sabotage their dreams. I thought about the soldiers waiting for my return, about the protocols that would protect others from the betrayal I had survived, about the legacy being built one decision at a time. Thomas had called me a burden. History would remember me as the woman who ensured no other service member would carry that weight alone. In the end, that was the only approval that mattered. Not from the family that tried to diminish me, but from the country I had sworn to serve and the soldiers I was privileged to lead. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. Sometimes it's becoming so completely yourself that their opinions lose all power to define you. Sometimes it's building something so much larger than their small vision that they become footnotes in your story rather than authors of it. I drove toward base, toward my soldiers, toward the future I had finally learned to claim without permission or apology. Behind me, the setting sun painted the sky in colors that promised tomorrow would be even brighter than today. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.